And it's so important to be clear about our assumptions and our why, because then everything we do cascades from that.
What are the secrets that drive the businesses you love or nonprofits you admire? Join us as we uncover the surprising ideas at the intersection of causes and brands. I'm Dave Raley.
And I'm Berna. Each episode, learn from leaders of nonprofits and companies that will give you insights that you can put into action. This is the Purpose and Profit Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Virtuous, the only responsive CRM that provides the fundraising, marketing, and volunteer tools you need to create personal connections with your donors and grow giving. Learn more at virtuous.org.
Welcome to the show today. Our guest is Leah Kral. She's a consultant, public speaker, and author who helps social entrepreneurs innovate and further social change. Her book, Innovation for Social Change: How Wildly Successful Nonprofits Inspire and Deliver Results, is a practical manual for nonprofits and charitable organizations seeking to innovate their way towards new and exciting possibilities. For decades, she has been providing tailored workshops and consulting to nonprofit leaders and boards across the country. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica, which we're going to need to talk about. And she loves the outdoors and trails in Northern Virginia and enjoys being an active volunteer in her community. Leah, why Jamaica?
Yeah, it was my life has just taken these interesting twists and turns in my career. But Jamaica was kind of selected for us. So when you apply to the Peace Corps, you don't always know or control where you're going to be sent. But I know when we found out, we were definitely doing a little happy dance, and our friends and family were teasing us about joining the Beach Corps. But but that wasn't exactly the reality.
Okay. Well, I am super excited about this conversation. I don't remember who turned me on to your book, but I had a friend refer me to the book. And, I'm so passionate about sustainable innovation and what that looks like in the nonprofit sector. So just to have this conversation is super fun for us. Let's start with just a simple question. What do you mean when you say nonprofit innovation? What do you mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think most people just automatically think of the for-profit world, when they hear that word innovation and the cool inventions we all like the iPad, or, like now you can visit the dentist's office and there's a little 3D printer that's printing out your crown. And, that's innovation. And that, I think that's what comes to top of mind for folks. But we have innovation all the time in the nonprofit sector too. I think about innovation simply as finding new and better ways of doing things. And it can be big, it can be small. So when I think of big innovations in the social change sector, I think of the American Civil Rights Movement. The creation of the 911 emergency phone system is an interesting story that involved philanthropy and nonprofits and first responders coming together to create that innovation. Another big innovation might be the types of projects that the X Prize Foundation works on with a national or international scope, like the global water crisis. Those are big. But there's also inventions in our sector. There's a great story of a professor at Stanford University who asked students to find solutions for the problem of premature deaths of babies in India. The incubators were not being used in hospitals, and they weren't quite sure why. And through this research project, the students discovered that what was the problem was that rural families could not reach the hospitals. So instead, the students came up with a new design for incubators that were portable and far less costly. They looked a little like miniature sleeping bags that were heated. And their innovation saved lives, right? So that's pretty great. But then innovation can also be quite small and humble. It might be a process improvement. The example I think of is, imagine a legal aid clinic with the walk-ins and a reception area, and the intake process is, lots and lots of forms and papers as you're describing your legal need and situation. And what if the receptionist comes up with the idea to shift that from a paper-based system to an iPad? That's a simple change, right? But now all of your information is just going directly into a database. You don't need someone to double enter it. So you've just saved time and steps that can be put to better use elsewhere. That's innovation too, right? So those are all good and we want those things, but how do we do that? And that's a lot of what my book is about, the how of innovation.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about all the time on this podcast is this intersection between for-profit and nonprofit. And so those are great examples. And we talk a lot about what we can learn from the for-profit sector for the nonprofit sector. So can you give an example of maybe a practice or something you've put in place or recommended that was specifically from the for-profit sector, but then used in the nonprofit world, and what kind of impact that had?
Wonderful. Yeah. I'm a big believer in stealing good ideas wherever, whenever you see them. And so I think of Pixar. Pixar's movies have won 23 Academy Awards and are some of the highest grossing animated films of all time, like Toy Story. So what's the secret to their success? Is there something we can steal from them? So something I found from Pixar is that teams are expected to give what they call brutal feedback to each other. A Pixar executive says that they assume early on that all of our movies suck, and the job of the creative feedback process is to get the movie from suck to unsuck. And so that's kind of shocking language, right? Like brutal feedback. But that same executive explained that importantly, everyone in the room knows that the questions raised must be in the spirit of making the creative product as good as it possibly can be. So without the manager setting the tone as a safe space, that kind of tough love feedback process would never get off the ground. So how do they do this? I was really curious about that. So they use a creative process called design thinking that's used by many marketing and design firms. It's been around for decades, but there are some parallels to designing a movie and designing nonprofit programs and interventions. And we can definitely translate design thinking techniques for our own use in nonprofits. So I can share a quick example of that in the nonprofit world and its impact. So design thinking is a process for exploring what's possible and thinking creatively and strategically. So with my version, the Leah version, or the nonprofit version of design thinking, we ask ourselves 3 questions. What's desirable, what's scalable, and what's feasible? That's kind of the thinking part. And then there's an action part, which is experimentation. So, if we just take one of those, what's desirable? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Are we good at identifying hidden needs for the people that we're serving? And nonprofits can struggle with this. There's a Henry Ford quote that goes something like, if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? So it can be hard to figure it out. We have to work to uncover those hidden needs. So a great story of that is Greyston Bakery. They're a workforce development nonprofit in Yonkers, New York. And the team at the bakery wanted to take on some of those hardest cases of the chronically unemployed. They work really hard to understand the problem they're trying to solve. And so their founder, a really smart guy, an aeronautical engineer, actually experimented with living on the street for a few weeks. He wanted to better understand the clients they serve, actually walk in their shoes. And what he learned was really powerful. So based on this experience, their team set to work incorporating lessons from those direct observations on the street to inform every detail of the bakery. For example, they created an apprenticeship program that's open to absolutely anyone. The bakery has a first come, first served waiting list for a position, and no background checks, if you can believe that. No background checks are done, no interviews are conducted. There's an on-site social worker who helps employees solve obstacles such as stress management, transportation, childcare, subsidized housing, referrals for drug rehabilitation. And I mean, it's tough, make no mistake. Sometimes fights break out at the bakery. 4 out of 5 workers might be gone within a week or 2, but they can always sign up again. So with their model, everyone gets a chance and some succeed. I think that's the key. So they're really a success in their field. They provide the dignity of work to those highest risk hires who were previously thought unemployable. So to me, that's a great example, right? They were asking themselves those hard questions, including what's desirable, to help them find clarity about their why and their how. And it's so important to be clear about our assumptions and our why, because then everything we do cascades from that.
Just for clarity for me, so the bakery is a nonprofit bakery.
That's right.
So what do they do with the profits? Do they donate it or something?
Let's see. So they're considered like a workforce development nonprofit. So they probably put it into a lot of those programs or wraparound services that they're offering, because they are helping, like the homeless or addicts. So, they're paying for things like an on-site social worker. So I imagine that's probably the case. I know that, Ben & Jerry's is one of their vendors. So like if you are eating Ben & Jerry's, I think it's their brownie ice cream. It's made at that bakery. So it's wonderful.
Yeah. Have you ever, I love the Pixar story, by the way. Have you ever had to have someone actually give that type of feedback to each other? That's where I was hoping the story was going, was where you had someone sit in a room and be like,
Yeah.
You're
Yeah,
terrible.
I've actually got a lot more about that in my book. But so a nonprofit I worked really closely with really embodies that. They call it their challenge culture. And Mayo Clinic, too, is another one that does this, where they're just very good. It's built right into the expectations. When you hire someone, it's laid out. You're recruiting people who, it's an interview questions like, tell me about a time when you challenged the status quo, or tell me about a time where you disagreed with your supervisor. How did it work out? So these organizations are looking for people who are comfortable with what I call respectful disagreement, right? And so I've seen that work. There's a lot to that, right? And there's more in my book about how to do that, like how supervisors can model it and so on. But yeah, I've seen it. And I don't think we can really have innovation otherwise, right? Because if you have a culture of fear, if people are too timid of speaking up, you're not going to, have people come forward with really good ideas to shake up the status quo.
That's great. Yeah, I think that the phrase that I've heard that really struck me was this idea that cultures that innovate really need to bring intellectual honesty. And that's, there's, I think the Pixar way of saying it, brutal feedback is just a little clearer. But the other piece of that, and I think nonprofits probably err more on the side of not having that kind of brutal feedback or intellectual honesty. But the other side of that coin is the idea of psychological safety. And how do you create a culture where it is not only safe to speak out, but you actually do speak out? And have you noticed, Leah, any sort of trends in as you think about nonprofit innovation specifically around, like, do you feel like nonprofits tend to err on one side of that or the other?
Let's see. I'm just mentally kind of thinking through my Rolodex of like the nonprofits that I've worked with, and I haven't seen it as much as I would like, but I have seen it in some cases, and seen the effect that has, which is a really good, good culture builder. But it has to be intentional. Like another example of a system or process that makes it intentional would be, performance reviews. So I've seen a nonprofit that actually, I know that will be a question in my performance review. Like my peers will be evaluating me on how did Leah challenge the status quo this year, and how did it work out, right? So when all the employees know that they will be incentivized, right, and their peers are going to be commenting, that bakes it right into the cake. And so I think you can't just kind of be accidental about it, right? You have to be intentional and, really build it into your systems.
Yeah, that's so good. I was just listening to an interview. I think it might have been earlier on our season, but where the leader we spoke to was talking about how it's so important to get that feedback. And if you, in the 360 review process, if you don't get it, like there's an expectation that there will be critical feedback. If you don't get it, then the person can't submit the review. It's like you have to send it back. That's such an interesting concept. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper. You talked about desirability, but you also mentioned terms like scalability, feasibility, and experimentation. This is going to be a choose your own adventure question. Choose one of those: scalability, feasibility, or experimentation, and tell me how you see those principles guide your work, guide the work in nonprofit innovation.
I can even give you like a very, very quick overview of them and then lean into one.
That would be helpful.
So in my book, I have a chapter on each one of those with kind of stories and thought exercise questions. What's desirable, as I mentioned, is just getting to, well, what's the problem we want to solve? And what's scalable? That question really helps nonprofit teams think about how to scale, how to build ecosystems for change. Social change is complex and often requires many groups coming together. You think of like the American Civil Rights Movement. What's feasible is getting to, we have limited resources. And even though we want our resources to be applied, to their highest and best use, there are so many problems we want to tackle. We have to narrow and focus and watch out for groundless optimism and be realistic. So, it's really good to unleash our imaginations when we ask those what's desirable, what's scalable questions. But it's so important to come back down to earth, and stress test our thinking. Then experimentation, that's what I'll kind of zoom in on. So those first three questions are really the thinking part, and then the last is the action part. Our dazzling idea may or may not work. We have to find out. So what we can do is design small experiments, learn and adjust before we scale and grow our idea. So one of my favorite examples of that, of nonprofit experimentation, is World Reader. And so World Reader is a nonprofit with a mission to bring digital books to disadvantaged children and their families. And when they launched back in 2010, they began several experiments at the same time. So in one experiment, they gave out Amazon Kindle e-reader machines or tablets to a small group of elementary students in Ghana. But what they found, they're really jazzed about that. They were like, this is the thing, this is what's going to work. But what they found was that these children would play during recess and the devices would break. So at the same time, though, their team was experimenting with a mobile app, which they learned from observation the young users actually much preferred. And so they went that direction. And today, almost 200,000 users a month are reading books on the mobile platform. And so what I like about this story, I think there's several good lessons. One, they spread their bets. So if World Reader would have just gone all in on those Kindle e-reader machines that they were pretty excited about, they may have never discovered the far better solution with the mobile app. So, it's far better to fail fast and fail small before investing too big. And experimentation is what helps us learn and innovate. But we have to build in some expectation and toleration of failure. And I think that can be missing a lot of the time. So it's so important for leaders and organizations, especially boards and executive directors, to have the right attitude towards risk and failure. I love the story from the Hewlett Foundation where they offer a prize to grants officers and encourage them to share what they called the worst grant from which you learned the most. And I think they offer silly door prizes, and they come together and they give themselves permission to kind of laugh and take the pressure off. Because of course, if we're innovating, if we're doing trial and error, we're not going to get every single thing right. But I think that's great. And also one of my clients has a board that encourages them to take risks and experiment, and they tell them it's okay to fail as long as they're learning. And then based on what they learn from those experiments and failures, they start to get clarity about what works.
That's so good. Well, I want to dive in, specifically just drill in a little bit on the worst grant from which you learn the most, because I think I would call it, I think, conventional wisdom that we've got to fail fast and experiment. Like that's not something that's uncommon in today's sort of literature. But I think about, Leah, what does it look like for a nonprofit leader? Let me think of how to word this question. I've worked with nonprofits where they're actually more concerned with not, quote unquote, wasting time with experimentation. They want to just build the thing, whatever it is. And so when you talk about, the example of the e-readers to the mobile app, that was an example where taking a little bit of additional time to actually get into quote unquote market and to experiment and learn, actually there's problems with this implementation. What would you say to a nonprofit leader who's trying to innovate and experiment, but is faced with a challenge from leadership to say, no, just build the thing. Like we don't experiment, like we got to move faster.
Yeah. I think stories like that World Reader one are good, if you're going to have to walk in and really make the case for experiments, then, coming in armed with stories like that might help you make your case, because it could be very costly, right, to go all in on something and it turn out to not really work out that great, right? So experiments can save you money in the long run. I think a really great example, just the right attitude I saw from an executive director. I remember he had seen a lot of podcasts fail at his organization. And so he had a program manager approach him after a number of these failures and, knock on his door all excited, like, I want to launch a podcast. Here's what it's going to look like. So this executive director is automatically kind of skeptical, like, I'm not so sure. I've seen too many of these, just not work out for our nonprofit. But he heard the person out. They were like, well, what if we treat this as an experiment? Here are the parameters. You do this many shows. These are the things we're going to watch for, right? And so that kind of helped their negotiation, right? By not treating it as a forever project, but kind of treating it as a, maybe you call it a minimum viable product or a test of some kind that can help you make your case.
Is your faith-based organization searching for a leader who truly aligns with your mission? Faith Search Partners is the premier executive search firm dedicated to faith-driven organizations. With over 130 years of combined experience and a 98% success rate, they will guide you through every step of the process, ensuring that you find the right leader to drive your mission forward. Trust the experts who live their faith. Visit faithsearchpartners.com today to learn more.
So I don't think we mentioned this in the pre-interview we had, but I actually worked at Mayo Clinic many, many, many years ago. And I know you probably talk about this in your book, but you've studied a lot of different companies, including Mayo Clinic, Fred Rogers, Alcoholics Anonymous. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from those that you can offer for nonprofits? I could just mention one of the things I love from Mayo Clinic is that they pair someone who specializes in admin and someone who specializes in actual medical care together, which I think is really important when it comes to nonprofits, like a program person and an admin person, where sometimes one or the other is leading both sides, which never works out, and everyone is in silos and they're mad at each other and there's a lot of friction. So that's one of my favorite takeaways from Mayo Clinic, but I'm curious from your own studies and research, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, I love Mayo Clinic is just an incredible example. They're probably the most innovative, hospital in the world. They're really famous for helping people who are incredibly sick. And just reading their story, collaborative medicine, right, is one of their principles. And so any nonprofit can, it might be intimidating, to think of Mayo Clinic, huge budget. But these are practices that any nonprofit, any size budget can do. I loved researching the startup stories of a lot of these powerhouse nonprofits we've heard of, like AA. And Alcoholics Anonymous, in their story, back in the 1930s, before AA existed, there was really this widespread ignorance about addiction. There were really no solutions. It was, if you were an alcoholic or an addict, there was mostly just stigma. Maybe you'd be institutionalized, in some cases, pretty extreme, even lobotomized. So there weren't good solutions for people. It was pretty desperate. So I think it was in the 1930s, these two founders of AA had not met each other yet. One was a salesman in New York City and the other was a doctor in Akron, Ohio. And addiction was really destroying their lives. And both had tried everything. The doctor was really close to losing his career because his hands shook from alcoholism. So at one point, the salesman from New York City was on a business trip in Akron, Ohio, and these two just ended up kind of randomly meeting. And they had this really honest conversation with each other about kind of the pain, their struggles. And what happened, it really surprised both of them that this conversation ended up being life-changing for both of them. And what they discovered was the healing power of one alcoholic talking to another, that they had stumbled onto a model that really might help other people too. So when they went their separate ways, they each formed a group, one in Akron and one in New York City, and they stayed in regular contact with each other and just started trying things. And some things worked and some things didn't. And through years of trial and error and kind of coming up with a theory for something they might want to try and then experimenting, they would learn and adjust. And they really learned the hard way about some things. Like they didn't know they needed to have members be anonymous at first. They had celebrities join. I think there was a really famous baseball player who joined and then very publicly fell off the wagon. And that really kind of just hurt the organization in a lot of ways. And they started thinking about anonymity and being anonymous and, privacy and things like that. So it took years, right? But eventually through that trial and error and collaboration, like Mayo Clinic, right, they discovered the 12-step model that is widely copied today. So I think, when you just look at their model, you can kind of see that over and over again with places like Mayo or AA or Habitat or the civil rights movement. With nonprofits, you usually have a founder, really passionate founder or small group of founders who care deeply about a social problem. Maybe it personally affects them. But they just aren't sure about how they're going to solve it. And they usually have very few resources. Maybe they're learning through trial and error. But this is really good news for all of us because, most of these powerhouse nonprofits start small, right, with just a seed of an idea. And so I think the key lesson is that, a nonprofit's limited size and budget are not a constraint to boldly inspired thinking and setting the world ablaze.
When you, one of the things you also talk about in the book is this idea of just an innovation superpower. One, that's the fun phrase. It makes me smile. How can individuals or organizations identify and harness what you call an innovation superpower?
Yeah, the last section of my book is all about how to bring our innovation A game. And so while the kind of first part of the book is a lot about how to be innovative as an organization, working in teams and partnerships, systems, processes, and so on. This last part of the book is kind of the personal reflection. And so, yeah, what I learned is that social entrepreneurs and successful nonprofit innovators are really good at understanding themselves, their gifts, and their passions. You know, to be entrepreneurial, we have to say no to things and prioritize what we spend our time on. So are we guardians of our time in the same way that we're guardians of our bank account, right? We can't say yes to everything, and we have limited time and have to make smart trade-offs with our time. So how can we confidently say no to things and focus on what we do best? And it starts by being clear about our unique abilities and our vision for our life. So, you know, thinking about, well, what's my superpower? But how do you figure this out? So, you know, in our early careers, we might be in a discovery phase, kind of finding our way, and that's how it should be. It took me years to figure out kind of my passion and my career path through trial and error. You know, my life really, it took me on some wild twists and turns. I think everybody's will. But there are some questions that I identified that might help, right? So I'll just share some of those. But one question could be, you know, what in your life sparks joy? Is there something that really makes you happy? Or the converse, what do you hate doing? And it's kind of a process of elimination and self-discovery. For example, at a nonprofit, I volunteered to help organize a conference, and I learned I absolutely hate doing that. So no events career for me, right? But I learned from that. Another question might be, do you have a really wacky combination of interests? And if you think about Fred Rogers, what a unique set of skills this man had, right? He was into puppetry, music. He went to Presbyterian seminary, and he was really curious about a career in television. You know, maybe somebody else, it might be economics and chess. For me, like, I really love reading biographies. That's like my favorite nerd thing to do. That's what I'm curled up reading biographies on the weekend. I never thought that would somehow work into my career, but, you know, I pulled a lot of those biographies into the book that I wrote. You know, another question to think about there is a major life trial. It really might shape your life. Like for Martin Luther King, it was those unjust Jim Crow laws that were affecting him, his family, his community. With Fred Rogers, he had severe childhood asthma that isolated him as a child. And so he ended up just kind of creating puppets and skits to pass the time and became really good at it, right? So sometimes you might have a major life challenge that shapes your passions and your gifts and who you are. I love that. I think it was Congressman Elijah Cummings who said he tells his children, don't ask why something happened to you, ask why it happened for you. And I think that's really powerful. So finding your superpower will help you be more entrepreneurial. Life is short and the world needs your talent.
So good. Do you, I think it's implied here, but do you think that everybody has an innovation superpower? I know some people tend to think, some people think, oh yeah, I'm innovative. And other people think, oh no, I'm not innovative. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I think it's in all of us. You know, it's just looking for better ways of doing things. You know, like the Mayo Clinic, one of the stories from there is their night staff just we're really thinking hard about a good night's sleep for patients, and that, you know, noise is going to disrupt the healing process. And they came up with the simple idea, like, let's do noise studies. And just through that idea came up with quieter designs for food carts, lower decibels for paging, you know, something that seems so simple. But I think it's just, you know, if your superpower is empathy or paying attention, you know, in your environment or, you know, the people you're serving, I think really good things can come out of that, no matter who you are.
You know, one of the really amazing viewpoints that you have is you've been able to talk to so many different people. Like you just mentioned before we got on here, you know, how many podcasts you've done, how many nonprofits and for-profits you've worked with. Of all of that you've learned, to the nonprofit listeners right now, what advice would you give them specifically from any for-profit experience that you have?
I guess one thing I think about at the intersection of nonprofit and for-profit worlds is just acknowledging that there can be some pain and talking past each other that can happen sometimes. So on a lot of nonprofit boards, we have people from the for-profit world, and there's so much good stuff coming from the for-profit world, all sorts of great systems, great thinkers, right? Like, you know, Stephen Covey and Drucker and Deming and Six Sigma, and, you know, you could go on design thinking, right? Or things kind of that you can steal from the for-profit world. But a pain point can be just, say you're on a board of a nonprofit and you're really jazzed about something. You're like, let's take this practice from the for-profit world and just kind of plunk it on top of this nonprofit and make them do it. And I think that can be, you see that a lot, right? And it comes from good intentions, but I think being thoughtfully translating things that make sense in the nonprofit world, like what I shared with design thinking, like the version I shared is not what they use exactly at Pixar, right? It's been tailored. So I think that could be a really good practice and save folks some pain points. Another example along those lines, just using the word strategy. I've in my consulting with nonprofit clients, just simply using the word strategy. I learned the hard way that can mean different things to different people. Maybe someone's had a lousy experience with a strategy consultant in the past. But that may not be the language that's used in the nonprofit space. So being mindful, I think, could really help bridge those two worlds.
Yeah, I think on the for-profit side, same. Like if you're coming from nonprofit to for-profit, figure out, it's the basics of marketing, right? Figure out who your audience is and tailor your message. But that's right. Great advice. Yeah. Well, if you've listened to our podcast before, you know that we end every podcast with a lightning round. So really grateful for all of the insight you've given us so far, but let's jump into the lightning round. I know you don't know these questions, so I'll ask them and just kind of the first thing that comes to mind. So are you ready?
All set.
All right. First question. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, wow. Let's see. I had a Wonder Woman lunchbox, so I probably wanted to be Wonder Woman.
Hence the superpower metaphor, yeah. I wonder.
There you go. Nice. Okay. What is your favorite podcast that you listen to?
Oh, wow. Well, let's see. I really enjoyed, listening to your podcast. I really enjoyed listening to your interview that you did with the CEO from Chick-fil-A. That was a lot of fun. So let me think if there are any other favorites. I'm more of a reader, far more of a reader than a listener.
Well, that's perfect, because the next question is, what book are you reading? So
we'll go with that. Let's see. I read I'm such a reader, so I'm reading like multiple books simultaneously. But I just finished a fantastic book called A More Beautiful Question, which is it's been out for a while. I think it had its 10th anniversary come out, but so good. It's all about using questions to spark creativity and innovation. And it was a great read.
If you haven't listened to our episode with Chad Littlefield, it's all about asking powerful questions. So that might be a good one if you like that book.
Fantastic.
What show are you binging on your preferred streaming platform?
I am binging No Murders in the Building. It's a lot of fun.
Okay. I haven't heard that, but I heard about it. Yeah.
Oh,
it's fun. Yeah. Steve Martin, there's a lot of kind of just very silly comedy, a lot of like kind of age jokes, because you've got Steve Martin and Martin Short, and I forget the actress's name, far younger, right? And they just have this great kind of dynamic between the three of them, and lots of age jokes and theater jokes, New York jokes. It's cute.
I think that's Selena Gomez.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, she's wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. What app do you use the most?
Oh gosh, probably my grocery list.
That's good. I use Alexa for my grocery list, so I understand. And last question, what refreshes and refuels you?
Let's see. I really enjoy nature, and I live here in the DC area where we just have like great, I'm in the suburbs and we just have wonderful trails. I probably do a 4-mile walk every day, and most days I see deer, sometimes foxes or hawks, and that just really calms me, and I find very peaceful.
Nice.
I love it. It's a great way to end the conversation. Leah, it's been so great. Appreciate you and just your willingness to invest in the audience, and candidly, as somebody who's also been working on a book, the years of just energy and devotion and hard work that it takes to bring something like that to life.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was an honor to be on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Awesome. If people are looking for you, they can certainly definitely look up the book, Innovation for Social Change. But any other places they should look to find you?
I have a website. It's just my name, leahkral.com. And from there, you can find my blog on Substack. And, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, there's a really wonderful, active nonprofit community, a lot of engagement there. And the book is available at all major retailers. So definitely reach out and connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Leah. And for our listeners, I hope you've learned something today. You've been challenged. You've seen yourself as an innovator and as somebody who has an innovation superpower. Until next time.
We're grateful for our partners this season, including Virtuous, a software company committed to helping nonprofits grow generosity. Faith Search Partners, an executive search firm specifically for faith-based organizations. And Imago Consulting, an advisory firm that helps nonprofits and businesses grow through innovation. For more episodes, find us wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so that you're always up to date. We'd love it if you would rate the show and leave us a review. Your feedback is valuable to us. Follow the show on LinkedIn, or you can reach us at our website at purposeandprofitpodcast.com. You can also sign up for our email newsletter to get updates whenever we launch a new episode. Thanks for listening.